Hello, ladies. Welcome back to another episode. Today, I'm super excited. We have Stefanie. She lives in NYC. Go ahead and have your visions of all the food you would eat and the shows you would see. But what's more fantastic is she's the author of The Ambition Penalty. And I can't wait. I'm going to shut my mouth. Talk to us. What is the
Mm,
ambition penalty? What happens? How do we get in that? How do we get out?
yes. The ambition penalty really speaks to the ways women's ambition gets weaponized against them. So, for years, women have been told that the reason they're overworked and underpaid and can't get ahead to the same extent as their male peers is because they aren't ambitious enough, or confident enough, or assertive enough. And yet, what we see in the research is that women assert themselves, they speak up, they ask for more, they negotiate at very similar or even higher rates relative to their male peers, but they are less likely to get what they ask for, not because they're doing something wrong, but because people do not have a good reaction to ambitious women. Even if you think about changing the pronoun in front of the word ambitious itself, he's ambitious has a very positive connotation. He's independent. He's a go-getter. That's the guy we want on our team. She's ambitious immediately changes it to something negative. She's selfish. She's just out for herself. She's not a team player. She's difficult to work with. And so I think it really reveals how this kind of gendered catch-22 leaves women in a position with no real great way to get ahead, not because of something they're doing, but because of the way the environment responds to them differently when they engage in the exact same behaviors that their male peers can reliably implement to get ahead. And I argue in this book that this is the way inequality continues to be reproduced, even as you have younger generations more ambitious and educated than ever.
As I listen to you speak, all I can think about is like the 1950s when we had kind of we were at that turning point where, okay, are we going to be Rosie the Riveter
Mhm.
or are we going to be the housewife? And it's not lost on me that miraculously overnight, these single income families all bought TVs. So they could indoctrinate the next generation with this housewife. What do you think that plays into where we are today with this?
I would say there's this idea that we have come so far. And yet, what I document in this book is the extent to which personal and professional ambition, private versus public, is still framed as mutually exclusive for women and mutually reinforcing for men. There is still this idea that for women to succeed professionally, by necessity, they must have to make a trade off in their personal life. And there are some logistical realities to this, right? There's this phrase like, if you want to have it all, you have to do it all. And the data suggests that that is true, but that is only true for women. Men are not doing it all. Men have more access to free time, to leisure time relative to women, and they did not have to give up any of their professional power or economic power to access it. And so I think we still get caught in these narratives that you can make this choice or that choice. And to be one is not to be the other. And if you choose to be a mom, then you can't have hopes and dreams beyond motherhood. And if you choose to have a career, then you cannot expect to be a good wife or mother, partner, or person. It's just not a standard that continues to be kind of passed within or assumed within a current cultural conversation, even as these trends have like evolved from what you were mentioning, like Rose the Riveter, like now it's the girl boss versus the trad wife. These same dichotomies are still setting us up in ways that are false choices that are incredibly gendered and we do not expect men to make. And so what I'm trying to peel back is both the research and then what does that say about the kind of cultural assumptions we're making and how those aren't actually true at all and how they're keeping us stuck where we are.
I love that. And I love that you're just calling it what it is because
Mm.
people who are in it, they know it, they feel it. In their gut, they know it's there. So, what could you kind of offer to a woman, a lady, who feels like she is being penalized for being ambitious? Should she slow her roll? Should she try to conform? Should she double down and turn the lights off, hit the throttle? Like, what's the best move?
Yeah, so I just want to first validate that what she's experiencing is not a personal problem. This is one of the things that came up a lot when I was doing interviews for this book. Because we don't talk about these dynamics, when women do experience this backlash, they think, maybe I really don't deserve more, or maybe I really am not qualified, or maybe I really should just be grateful. And we've been so conditioned into believing the problem is us that we also internalize the backlash that isn't about us, but about a very gendered environment around us as personal too. And so I just want to say, like, it's not you, it's them. And then what do you do from there? Well, you have a few things that you have to keep in mind. One is like just the reality of your circumstances. So ideally, like you're not going to operate in that environment, and an environment that punishes you for the same behaviors that are rewarded in your male peers is not a good environment. But the truth is, you probably have bills to pay, and you probably do need to maintain your economic security. So I do think constantly being on the lookout for other opportunities and never foreclosing yourself to having outside options, it really does help take a lot of the pressure off of any single environment so that if you wind up in this kind of position, you do have more access to outside opportunities. So, always diversifying opportunity, I think, is incredibly important. And then understanding that changing the environment around you instead of something within you is very important. But really, the message of this book is that whatever we can do individually is inherently limited. What we really need to do to shift women's outcomes, women as a social class, not just any individual woman's outcomes, is shift these environments more at scale, at collectively. And so in the book, in every chapter, I talk about some of the things that do that. So when companies have pay transparency policies, for example, we know that gaps across promotion rates change. There's more women in management. Women throughout the organization are paid more equitably. We know that when women are in management, not as tokens or one or two people, but at scale, 30% or more, the literal culture of the workplace starts to change, not just having some token people in leadership. We know that as remote policies or flexible policies, autonomous work policies are adopted, it allows more people to partake in the workplace and to advance within it, and for rewards to be distributed in ways that align more with people who perform rather than who are just present, because performance is actually the metric that should matter. And so to implement that kind of systemic change, what is really clear is that you can't do it alone. You have to work collectively. And so a lot of this book is about coalition building and really working to build our sources of community, both in our interpersonal spheres, in our institutional spheres like our workplaces and our schools, our community groups, and then at the political and cultural level. So locally, at a state level, at a national level. And we see when we look back at history or when we look at interventions that have really moved the needle in terms of women's outcomes, it's always been the collective interventions that work on shifting the environment around us, as opposed to telling any individual woman to change something within her. That's when the outcomes really change, are those group interventions.
Love that you make it so clear to understand that, yes, this isn't something that is a you problem. This is
Hmm.
something that's a bigger problem, and thus it needs a bigger solution, a bigger approach. So
That's right.
how do we band together? How does someone who's listening to this in her kitchen say, I want to join the fight? Where do
Yeah.
they need to go? What do they need to do?
So I think, I talked about some of the solutions that I lay out in the book. I talked about pay transparency, for example. I think it's important to think about how you can start to practice those kinds of things in your day to day life. So even if you're not in a place where there is like let's say a federal policy or a state policy or a local policy where these kind of interventions that we know work are in place, what you can do is advocate for that policy within your own institutions, like within your workplace. Maybe there's not a law for it, but that doesn't mean that your workplace can't opt into it, or if they are opting into it, that there can be better accountability mechanisms and that you can start coalition building around holding those institutions accountable. Or if that feels like too risky, and I want to acknowledge that all of these interventions do come with risks of their own, you can still experience backlash for speaking up in this way. But I think it's backlash that I would argue is worthwhile. But even interpersonally, you can practice something like pay transparency, just sharing with other people, not just what you've made, but like how who you spoke to when you negotiated, who was receptive, who wasn't. Sharing that kind of insider institutional knowledge and being transparent with other people is a very, very powerful way, such that So to bring about change in ways that even if like a political party or a place or an institution is not willing to implement those policies, when people start practicing those things interpersonally anyway, it puts pressure on the institutions to adapt. And so I use the example here. I'm in New York City. My daughter will go to pre-K this fall. She's 2 years old, and that will cost $0. So I think we have often got into this idea that that where we are is impossible, and if it's not you, if it's the system, what can you really do about it? But I think what these kind of different environments show us is that we have solutions. We know what works. We know what matters for people. What we're missing is that kind of collective action and that institutional will to actually put these policies in place. Because when people come together to demand change, those changes can be implemented incredibly quickly.
Hmm. I love that you're kind of just opening the thought on this, sounding the alarm, bringing into the forefront things that people are thinking on their own, and just kind of bringing it, validating it. I love that. So if someone's listening and they're like, I want to learn more about this, I want to get into her book, I want to learn more about her resources, where can folks find you online?
Yeah, so the book is called The Ambition Penalty: How Corporate Culture Tells Women to Step Up and Then Pushes Them Down, which you can get wherever you get your books. It's an audiobook, it's ebook, it's hardcover, and I am online on Instagram at Stefanie O'Connell. I have a newsletter called Too Ambitious, and I share a lot of data points specifically. I take a data approach to research because I think oftentimes career advice for women always gets positioned through this anecdotal lens. And that unfortunately can wind up reinforcing a lot of the barriers we're talking about, because it tells the story that like this worked for me, and so if it doesn't work for you, then the problem is you. And what we see when we look at these things not under the lens of the exception but the rule, when we look at it statistically, when we have large data sets, it tells us more accurately what is actually working, what is actually not, and more importantly, what the problem really is. Because for so long, these problems have been assumed to be something that the data show they're not. There is not an issue of women lacking ambition. There is not an issue of women not negotiating their salaries. There is not an issue of women not having confidence. There is an issue with the way the world responds to it. And as long as we continue to misdiagnose that problem, we will not overcome these barriers.
I love that. And I loved having you on today. I'm just sharing this messaging, helping us join your cause and kind of link arms together. With that, like, what do you want to leave our audience with today?
I want people to think of the ways that, one, the way this has shown up in their own life, and to start to contextualize their experience within a broader experience of what all women are experiencing. It helps us really get out of the framework of personalizing these problems and starting to understand them as larger issues that are experienced by many women. And when we come together and share those experiences more honestly, we interrupt these cycles of gaslighting ourselves into thinking it's us. We kind of strip away the shame that so often comes from the backlash when we believe and can have been conditioned to believe that we were the problem. And in sharing our own stories, we help other people share more honestly too. And as more people feel more comfortable to share, it's not just that we develop solidarity, it's that it literally changes the way people understand women's experiences. So many of the issues women are facing, I would say in a modern context, are with the way discrimination plays out. It's not explicit. It happens through these more subtle forms. And so it's not people saying like, we're not going to hire you or advance you or give you a raise because you're a woman. They're going to say, well, she's just difficult to work with, even though she did the same thing that he did. And he's like the guy we're going to put at the top of the team, right? And because it's that subtlety, what you have is this kind of cultural story that, well, there are no more barriers to women in the workplace. And so, whatever inequality emerges within a modern context is just women holding themselves back. And so what I think we need to do to combat that story is be very, very clear about these dynamics, that if you are not experiencing them yourself, you literally may not know they exist. And that's important because the people who are not experiencing this are the people who run these companies. Over 80% of workplace management is men.
Mhm.
And so oftentimes there is like a literal ignorance around what is actually happening in working women's lives. And you really can't address these barriers unless you even know that they're there. And I'll give another example of these like maddening double standards, but I think it's really illustrative of the way we have been sold this story that inequality is all in the past, and yet we're seeing it reinforced. So in this paper, the researchers studied why women were prevented from accessing positions of leadership at work. And what they found was that nobody was sitting around again saying, well, we're not going to promote her because she's a woman. Instead, what happened was other identity characteristics were weaponized against women through double standards that were not applied to their male peers. So if it was a young woman vying for leadership, she would be considered too young to be seen as a leader. We can't take her seriously. She's inexperienced. If it was an older woman, she'd be considered too old. And so there's no right age for a woman to be seen as a leader. And yet for men, a young man the same age as the young woman who is considered too young to be seen as a leader is thought of as fresh new thinking. He's going to take us into the future. That's the guy we need to lead us forward. And an older gentleman the same age as the older woman who was considered too old has his age also reframed as an asset. He's a seasoned leader, an experienced leader. He's going to bring this
Mhm.
really important institutional wisdom. And you wind up having a gender bias that winds up getting disguised through this weaponization of other identity characteristics. And in this paper, they found 30 different aspects of identity, from age to race to parental status to physical attractiveness, that were weaponized against women, while the same things that were seen as liabilities were seen as assets in men. And so that's why I, again, take this statistical framing to it, because I think it helps better expose what we think of as maybe like personal or individual or anecdotal, and says, oh, no, 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 this is happening at scale. And that's important for men to realize too, because they're overwhelmingly the ones in charge of these organizations that continue to reproduce these patterns.
So just to kind of make sure I'm, reframing it correctly, you feel like men also carry a burden in making these changes in this.
Absolutely. Like, we're talking about changing the way corporations, the world responds to men and women's ambitions. So the people who have the most power within those systems, which is by every objective measure men, they're actually incredibly important for facilitating this change. But I would say women are too. I think like these ideas of what drives this backlash. What drives the backlash is this idea that men should be one way and women should be another way. Men should be confident, strong, bold, independent, and women should be the opposite. And if you really act out of alignment with those ideals, or if women act in ways that we attribute to men, that's what triggers the backlash against them. And same is true if men operate with compassion and care, like they're judged and stigmatized too. So that is not something that only men perpetrate or only women perpetrate, like being on the judgment side of it. That is instigated by a broader set of cultural norms that we are all conditioned into from the moment we're born, right? This idea of division, this idea of mutual exclusion, and to be a boy is one way, to be a girl is another way. Is it pink or blue? Is it dolls or trucks, right? And what that effectively does is set you up for backlash, judgment, stigma, penalties when you violate the expectations of your quote unquote role. And that doesn't serve men or women. And the responsibility for shifting that is on men and women, though men absolutely have the vast majority of public power. So there is an extra responsibility.
I have loved this. Thank you so much for coming on today and sharing these ideas and challenging some of our existing ideas, because when we know better, we do better. And sometimes it just takes someone like you to put it out there for others to go, yeah, I was feeling that too. So we'll be sure we'll drop all the info in the show notes for y'all so you can grab her book where you get your books. You can find her on the socials and connect. And I just really, again, can't thank you enough for coming on and sharing this with our audience. It's been a joy.
Thank you so much for having me.